The Targaryens had dragons for 200 years after they fled Valyria. 200 years of conquest, of fire and blood, of sitting on a throne made of melted swords. And the entire time, their dragons were shrinking. Not slowly, not subtly. Generation by generation, the dragons of House Targaryen got smaller, weaker, and less specialized than the creatures their ancestors rode in the Freehold. Meraxes was terrifying. Vhagar grew to be a mountain with wings. But by the end, the last Targaryen dragons were the size of dogs. They lost teeth, they lost fire, they lost the plot. Why? Because when the Targaryens escaped the doom of Valyria, they brought their eggs, they brought their bloodline, they brought some of their traditions, but they left behind the one thing that actually made the bond work at full power, the blood magic. My name is Maester Black, and today I'm going to show you exactly what the ancient dragonlord families of Valyria did that the Targaryens stopped doing, what the claiming process actually looked like in the Freehold. Dark, deliberate, and soaked in sacrificial magic that would make the Citadel burn every scroll I've ever written. There are 3 types of dragons you can claim: Egg, Lost Rider, Wild. Each one more dangerous than the last, and the gap is not close. Today, we start with the Egg, the safest path. And even this one required you to do things that the Westerosi would call monstrous. The Freehold and the dark science of bonding. Let's set the table properly, because context is everything here. The Valyrian Freehold was not a civilization that happened to have dragons. It was a civilization built on the systematic domination of dragons, perfected across thousands of years by 40 dragonlord families who treated the bonding process like a sacred science. Each family had its own traditions, its own secret rites, its own closely guarded ceremonies that outsiders almost never witnessed. But underneath all of those traditions lived a common framework, a dark, consistent architecture that every family built their rituals on top of. And that architecture had a name: blood magic. The sorcerers of Valyria, and many of the great dragonlord families were sorcerers. Those bloodlines intertwined constantly, practiced a form of magic that required biological cost, not symbolic cost, not prayer, actual sacrifice. The body as a conduit, blood as currency, pain as proof of intent. This was not magic that responded to words alone. It responded to what you were willing to give. And the reason dragonlord blood worked where no one else's could, the reason 40 Valyrian families could ride dragons while the rest of the world just died trying, was because something in their bloodline had been altered by generations of exactly this kind of magic. Whether that alteration came from ancient pacts with the dragons themselves, from exposure to the volcanic sorcery beneath the 14 fires, or from something even darker that the histories don't fully admit, the result was the same. Valyrian blood resonated with dragons at a fundamental level. Now, 3 types of claims, 3 completely different risk profiles. The dragon egg. You are there from the first breath. The dragon's entire frame of reference for humanity is you. The bond starts clean, uncontested, and can be built from the ground up with full magical investment. This is the gold standard. Now, the dragons with a lost rider. The dragon already knows what a bond feels like. It knows that bond is gone. You are walking up to a grieving apex predator and asking it to start over. The stone has cracks in it before you even begin. And finally, the wild dragons. These dragons have never been claimed, never been touched, has no concept of a rider, and no interest in developing one. Several dragonlord families banned their members from attempting wild claims because the mortality rate was simply too consistent to justify. We'll get into exactly how bad those numbers were in Part 3. Egg is where every family wanted to be, and now I'll show you exactly what they did when they got there, including the parts that never made it into the histories that Westerosi maesters actually read. Choosing the egg. The selection is already magic. No serious dragonlord family picked an egg the way you'd pick fruit at a market. The selection process was the beginning of the ritual. It was already magic. The mystically inclined families employed sorcerers to perform what can only be described as a reading, pressing hands to the shell, entering some kind of trance state, and essentially attempting to sense the nascent consciousness developing inside. They were looking for compatibility, temperament, whether this particular unborn dragon would resonate with a specific claimant's blood. And they took these readings seriously, because a mismatch at the selection phase meant a bond that would fight itself for decades. The more biologically focused families kept meticulous records across generations. Dragon lineages cross-referenced like noble marriage contracts. They wanted specific outcomes. Larger dragons for military dominance, more intelligent dragons for reconnaissance and complex commands, higher fire output for siege work. These families treated dragon claiming with the same cold calculation they applied to breeding war horses, and they were devastatingly effective at it. And then there were the families who believed the dragon was already participating in the selection before it hatched, that the right egg would physically respond to the right claimant, warming perceptibly when held by someone compatible, remaining cool in the hands of someone wrong for it. These families had their potential claimants hold every available egg before a decision was ever made. The dragon, they believed, was choosing too. Color carried meaning across nearly all traditions, even when the interpretations differed. Deep crimson eggs, aggressive, dominant, built for war. Pale or silver-shelled eggs, speed, cunning, highly responsive to complex commands. Dark, near-black eggs, like the clutch the Targaryens famously carried to Dragonstone, were prized and feared in equal measure across multiple family traditions. Immense potential, volatile temperament. Some families coveted them above all others. Some refused them entirely and considered the refusal wisdom rather than cowardice. Most families also placed the egg with the claimant as early as possible. Not at birth, before birth in many cases, positioned in the mother's chambers during the final months of pregnancy. This was not sentiment. This was deliberate magical attunement. The theory held that the claimant's blood, carrying whatever sorcerous resonance made them a dragonlord, could begin influencing the developing dragon through the shell over time. That proximity was itself a form of slow, continuous ritual that made everything that came after more likely to succeed. The Targaryens kept this tradition, eggs in the cradle. They understood proximity mattered. What they lost was everything that came next. The hatching ritual. This is where it gets dark. The hatching was not a passive event. It was never a passive event. The idea that you place an egg in a warm room and wait is a Westerosi fairy tale, a sanitized version of a process that the ancient families would not recognize. The hatching was induced, and the way it was induced is the part of Valyrian history that got very quietly buried. The egg required extreme heat to reach the threshold. Temperatures that killed ordinary men, maintained in volcanic chambers beneath Valyria's great estates, in specialized kilns fed by dragonfire itself, in spaces that were themselves sacred and restricted. Getting the egg to hatching temperature was already a serious undertaking, involving controlled magical environments that took years to build. But heat alone was never enough. Every serious dragonlord tradition held that the hatching required a blood sacrifice at the critical moment. Not animal blood, not a proxy. The claimant's blood, introduced directly to the shell as the egg reached the threshold between containment and emergence. In the most intense traditions, this wasn't a clean cut on the palm. It was a significant sacrifice. Blood drawn in volume, sometimes maintained over hours of ceremony, with the claimant weakened and in pain as they pressed themselves against the egg in its full volcanic heat. The suffering was considered part of the offering. The magic responded to cost. A painless, bloodless ceremony wasn't a ceremony, it was theater. What that blood did, according to these traditions, was announce the claimant to the dragon in the final moments before it cracked through the shell. You are introducing yourself at the cellular level. You are saying, before it takes its first breath, before it sees its first light, I paid for you. I am the one who called you out. I am what you belong to. Accounts from multiple families describe hatchlings emerging already oriented toward the claimant, fixated, ignoring every other person in the chamber, not tame, Dragons are never truly tame, but anchored, imprinted in those first seconds on the specific blood that summoned them, in a way that would shape the next 100 years of both their lives. This is the piece the Targaryens lost. They kept the eggs, they kept the fire, they lost the blood cost, the actual magical transaction that made the bond deep rather than merely functional. Their dragons still came when called. They still flew. They still fought. But the attunement that the ancient families achieved, where rider and dragon developed together into something almost symbiotic, each sharpening the other toward a specific purpose, that depth was gone. And you can measure it. In the size of the dragons, in the specialization, in what those animals could and couldn't do compared to the dragons the freehold fielded. The first 30 seconds and why they decide everything. You have done the ritual. The blood is on the shell. The egg is cracking. Now the most critical window of the entire bonding process opens, and you have approximately 30 seconds to not ruin everything. Every family tradition, regardless of their philosophical differences, converged on the same practical instruction for this moment. Be present, be still, and do not show fear. The hatchling is disoriented. It is running on pure instinct. It is hotter than you expect, more aggressive than you expect, and it is reading you right now with senses that are already more sophisticated than anything you're prepared for. The families that practiced dominance philosophy claiming were brutally explicit about this. The dragon is deciding what you are. Prey reads as fear and retreat. Partner reads as calm, grounded authority. You have 30 seconds to answer that question with your body. Not your words, not your ceremony, not your bloodline on paper. With how you stand in front of it. Fail this with a hatchling barely 3 feet long, still figuring out its own legs, and you would spend the next decade fighting for control of a bond that never set correctly. The Targaryens, to their credit, maintained this understanding. Presence at the hatching was sacred to them, but presence alone, without the blood magic underneath it, was like building a castle on sand instead of bedrock. It held until it didn't. The egg is the gold standard. The blood ritual, the selection, the first 30 seconds, all of it designed to produce the deepest possible bond before the dragon has any other frame of reference for the world. The ancient families who did this correctly produced rider-dragon partnerships that lasted lifetimes and made them nearly unstoppable. The Targaryens did some of it and got some of the result, and watched their dragons diminish across 2 centuries until the last ones were shadows of what Balerion had been. In Part 2, the rider is dead, the dragon is alive, and someone has to walk in anyway. The blood magic gets darker, the survival odds drop significantly, and the traditions the great families developed for claiming a dragon mid-grief reveals something about Valyrian sorcery that is genuinely unsettling, because they weren't just trying to replace the dead rider. Some of them were trying to use the dead rider to make the new bond stick. Part 3 is the wild claim, the one families banned, the one with a mortality rate so consistent that the glory of succeeding barely justified the attempt, and yet people kept trying. Because the dragon you claimed wild, if you survived, was something the bonded families could barely imagine. Subscribe right now. Comment below. Do you think the Targaryens knew what they were giving up when they abandoned the blood magic? Or did they lose the knowledge entirely in the doom? I will see you in Part 2.